Hello and welcome to Wine and Olives. I'm Lori Kissell from Legio 20, Washington, D.C. I'm also a Latin teacher at Liberty High School in Fauquier County, Virginia. Wine and olives are two staples of Roman life, so let's go explore. We have some images here of different types of olives, things used in the production olives, the trees themselves, and soaps. And with olives, one of the most important words is unguo, unguere, the verb, to smear with oil. So let's go have some olives. So where did olives come from? Well, we know the story that they were a gift of Athena to the city of Athens, and in exchange they named the city after her. Olives became a symbol of Attica, the region around Athens, and of Athens herself. They were, however, never the most important Attic crop grown, and likely not a primary export. The farmlands, the arable areas in Attica, are insufficient to create enough olives for extensive export. And there we have Athena gifting the olive tree. So what do we need to know? We're going to talk about the production and uses of olives as we begin. Growing them, crushing them, which is not the same as pressing them, and transporting them. We'll also talk about some of the uses for olives as light, in cooking, for bodies, and for ritual. Let's talk growing. Good places to grow your olives are on the lower slopes of the Apennine Mountains in Italy. Most of Spain is good olive production territory. Southern Gaul is good olive production territory. Most of Greece, even though they can't grow as many as they'd like, is still good production territory. The Asiatic provinces also produce a number of olives and olive trees and olive oil. The coastal cities of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica in northern Africa, and several of the North African provinces that the Romans had acquired, were good areas for growing olives for olive oil. So here we can see several places that you might go looking for olives and olive oil. We can see olives spread over the trade map, both inside of and they're shipping it outside of the empire. One thing really nice about olives is that they are highly drought resistant. So many of these areas are not soaked in rainfall. Olives are, however, sensitive to frost, so they prefer a warmer climate. Olives don't grow as fast as we might hope, so you usually get a crop every other year, even in good soil. You can propagate your olives from cuttings, from ovules, which are the beginnings of seeds. They've been fertilized, but they haven't grown into full seeds yet, and from grafts. Cutting a piece of one olive tree and grafting it into another set of roots. Olives do not grow true to type from seeds, so you can't eat your olives, go plant the seeds in the backyard and get them. And olives are usually grown as either table or oil varieties, which don't always overlap. Olives are rarely monocultured, so you're not just going to devote a whole area to olive production. You might combine it with something else. Might you combine it with? Well, pastoralism is a good option, since as you have goats and sheep particularly, maybe some cows wandering along beneath the trees, nibbling on the grass, it works. Olives are harvested in autumn or early winter, before it gets too frosty. Greeks and Romans liked something they called white olives, particularly for oil. So in searching for white olives, we find out that those are called, ready? Olea europaea, European olive. That's terribly helpful, isn't it? All right, so we're going to crush your olives. One of the things you have to do is pack them in salt or salt water before you do anything else to your olives. Why? Well, olives are not edible raw. That you can't go to a tree and pick one and eat it. It is extremely bitter to the taste, and they can be downright toxic. They are nasty. So packing them in the salt or the salt water leaches out these chemicals called polyphenols, and then you can use your olives. So once they've been packed in the salt or salt water and the chemicals are leached out, now we can crush them. There are a lot of ways to crush your olives. The simplest is a flat bed of stone and a stone roller, sort of like a rolling pin or a wheel to go over them. You can use a mortar and pestle, but that would be very slow going, and putting some wooden sandals on and walking around on them. The best thing, however, for crushing your olives is a Roman device called a trapetum. So let's take a look at a few. This is a very simple crushing device. You have the wheel in the center and a beam out to the side so that you can use that beam to roll that wheel around the center, squash the olives, and as you can see, some oil rolls out. Or you could be Roman, and you're going to put the olives down in the large hemispherical bottom. Those two top pieces will roll as you push on the beams and go around and around. But make sure that you're not crushing the stones. That adds a very bitter taste to your olive oil. The luxury oils, the quality oils, remove all the stones first and make sure that there's only a minimal amount of stone crushed to relieve the bitterness. The ancients had machines for stone removal, but since they were of questionable effectiveness, there was an awful lot of hand pitting of the stones from the olives. Once you've crushed them, then they are moved over to frails and then to presses. Okay, so what is a frail? This is a frail. It's like a filter. It's woven thread or string cordage, usually hemp, cotton, linen, and it's like a very shallow basket and a filter. You're going to put the crushed olives into that and stack them in quite a few layers, and then we're going to press them. So the simplest, most common press that we would see is a thing called the beam, just a large wooden log, or it could be squared off. It would be weighted down with rocks or humans pulling on it. One end is fixed into a wall, and that becomes the fulcrum for you or your slaves to pull on it. As weight is added to this end of the beam, not in the wall, it's crushing the olives and the frails and pressing the oil out. Like this. So here we have one end in a wall, and we have the beam. We have a rock on top of the stack of frails and more rocks pulling down onto that lever, the beam. We also have a nice cartoon drawing from a coloring book. So here we can see a human and some rocks pulling on those stacked frails in the center and squeezing the olive oil out into the jar. And when it comes out, it looks something like this. Lovely olive oil. Of course, this is a modern picture. As time goes on, they come up with some nifty improvements to the beam press, including a winch, which is a little faster and puts a little more pressure on it, a lever and drum, and better anchoring, better pressing, more olive oil. They do add a screw press to this, and first it's in assistance of the beam, and then later it replaces the beam altogether. The direct screw press replaced the beam in the 1st century CE, all made possible because of the screw and screw nuts which were developed in the 3rd century BCE. But Pliny had to chime in on this, of course, and he says, yes, the screw does get out more olive oil, but it risks adding a bitterness to it, because if you press too much, you've included parts of the olive you didn't want in the oil, or so says Dear Pliny. So here we have a modern reconstruction of a screw press, pressing down on the frails. And we can see that you would turn that lever and add more pressure. So why are we doing this? Well, we're going to press the oil out, but there's still some water in it, and that's going to need to separate out. The Romans say ladle it from the top, says Cato and Columella. And the Greeks say, no, use a bottom spout in your container, your large jar, your amphorae, whatever, to separate it out. Both methods work, both methods are effective. What's left are sort of the solids of the olives, called a press cake, and that would be given to pigs as food and can be used on fields as fertilizer. We're not going to waste anything. So now that you've made olive oil, let's talk about transportation. Most olives, of course, are going to be raised and eaten locally, so there's not a lot to transport. But oil keeps better, lasts longer, and can be traded, especially those areas that don't grow olives. They also produced luxury olive oils known for their quality, their taste, and sometimes they added flavorings to those. Perhaps you've seen or tasted flavored olive oils, and that can vary from area to area and taste to taste. And many of these luxury oils could be traded like fine vintage wines. The area around Athens, Attica, and the Isle of Samos, Wanafrum, Baetica, Cyrenaica were all famous for their olive oils. Baetica in Spain, Cyrenaica in North Africa. Olive oil was stored and transported in large jars called dolia if you're a good Roman, pithoi if you're feeling Greek today. But it would be sold in amphorae, and those amphorae can vary in size. Small ones for personal use, larger ones for transportation, commercial use. So we're going to take a look at some of these vessels and transportation methods. About 2/3 of the shards in Mount Testaccio are from olive oil amphorae, leaving the other third from wines, grains, and other items transported in amphorae. The peak trade in olive oil was from about 140 to 165 CE. So here is Mount Testaccio. You can see houses built right up against the left side. You can see the Tiber River over to the upper right corner. It's a huge mountain right there, made entirely of shards from amphorae and other bits of garbage. You can also see some vehicles there and some very tiny people to give this scale. All right, so what are we going to use it for? Well, olive oil is great for light. You can put it in lamps, and those lamps could be made of pottery or bronze, gold, silver, iron, lead, ceramic. You notice pretty much anything that doesn't burn makes a great olive oil lamp. Your olive oil lamps could be single or multiple nozzle styles, so you might have one wick burning, which is going to burn less oil and give less light, or multiple nozzles with multiple wicks, creating more light, but it's going to use up the reservoir of oil in that lamp a little bit faster. These lamps could be freestanding, set it on a desk or a shelf nearby, or suspended. They would hang from a lamp stand, which could be small and set on your desk, or tall and stand in a room, and it would hold 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, lots of oil lamps. And the lamp stand, you may have run into the word, is a candelabrum. So in the ancient world, the candelabrum held lamps, not specifically candles. Best part about using olive oil in your lamp is that it is smokeless, or some of the really low-grade oils will produce a minimal amount of smoke. If you've ever tried to use an oil lamp, kerosene oil, you know that you've got to adjust the wick very carefully or you get billows of black smoke. Stains the ceiling as well, but not with olive oil. So here we have a single nozzle lamp. You can see the hole for filling the lamp in the center and the wick and the light at the other end. Or you could have a multiple nozzle lamp there, a little bit of a handle, a filling hole, and a couple of places to add your wicks and burn. And you could have this style, you can see the chains on it so it would hang, and you could have quite a few of those to make it look very light and bright in your room. You could use olive oil for cooking. Roman recipes absolutely abound with olive oil. It can be used as a flavoring, it can be used for frying, it can add texture to your meals. You can dunk your morning bread in olive oil, particularly if you've ever made real Roman bread or any breads that don't include all of the modern leavening and softening and emulsifying ingredients, or preservatives. You know that this bread can get incredibly hard incredibly fast. And so one way to soften it up enough that you may even gnaw on it and eat it is to dunk it in some olive oil. You could even add flavor to that if it made you happy. You can infuse your olive oil with flavors. Various herbs have been added to olive oils to change the flavor. But there is that terrible debate. If you flavor your olive oil, have you gone decadent? Are you truly Roman anymore, or have you become Orientalized? We could also use oil on the bodies. You may recognize the metal flask there and the strigils. You could use it as skin oils. If you have dry skin, cracking around the nails or dry brittle nails, soaking it with olive oil or smearing olive oil on it until it's absorbed and then wipe off the excess can be great for your skin. You can scent it so you don't walk around smelling like a salad. Another wonderful use, if you ever get Sharpie on you and it's not washing off right away, olive oil will do it. And so we have the metal flask, we have a glass flask, and we wouldn't be complete if we didn't have a gentleman using his strigil. We could also turn olive oil into perfumes for the body. So if you put fragrant herbs or flowers into it, you're not creating the alcohol-based perfumes and colognes of the modern era. You are producing unguents and attars, but the scent from the rose petals or herbs will leach out into the oil and become very concentrated, and it works quite well. So we have one here called Hermetica perfume oil. Rather nice stuff. You could also use olive oil to carry medicaments, so to internalize some medicines, either cures or preventatives. And this is a modern piece put out, but if you look, we've got quite a few things that could be used with for the body of olive oil: psoriasis and diaper rash treatment, eye makeup remover, throat soother, soften your skin, earache relief, lice treatment, smooth shave, do-it-yourself lip balm, stop snoring, I'm not even asking, hair tonic, and bath oil. I'm not saying do all those things, but it could be used for all of those things. Olive oil was also used in ritual. So oil from the sacred trees, called the Morii, was often given as prizes in the Panathenaic Games. So here we have some Panathenaic type runners competing to win some olive oil perhaps, and honor and glory, of course. We might also use it in ritual as part of libations. So here we have a good Roman with his head covered properly, pouring oil from his patera. And to be fair, we have some Greeks also pouring out oil, She might be Artemis there. She's holding a bow. It's a possibility. And my favorite, perhaps, is its use in a Roman wedding, where you would anoint the couple's new door to their new home using oil-soaked or fat-soaked wool, depending on what you had available. You're not smearing the whole door. You are smearing the door frame around the door to show prosperity, that we're bringing food and clothing and light and heat to this new home with our oil and our wool. And there we have a nice wedding relief, the new couple, but they're not, alas, they're not doing the smearing. Okay, as we're about to move over into grapes half of this, we can see that olives and grapes have some similarities in their production. We're going to grow them, get them off the plants. You can dry either one before and just eat it. Grapes, of course, become raisins. Olives are cured. They've got to be that salt-soaked first, though, and eat them. But you can go to crushing and pressing. There are some differences. The grapes are going to ferment into wine. Olives are going to split into the water and the oil, and all can be bottled, stored, and transported. So let's talk about wine, grape to glass. We have a lovely little celebratory scene, one of the Alma Tadema paintings. I've talked about this a lot. So let's talk. Grapes come in varietals, and they have different growing regions. How is wine produced? How and where is wine traded? And what do we use it for, besides the obvious? So grape varieties are known and noted for their different growing areas, different flavors, that you can distinguish them by the shape of the grape. Is it a fat, round grape? Is it a long, narrow grape? You can distinguish them by their manner of clustering. Do they grow in abundant clusters? Are there lots of grapes to a cluster? And we can also distinguish varietals for their flavor. Are they better for wine or are they better for fruit? Some of our famous wines produced are the Falernian, Caecuban, and Cetinum from Roman literature. Some of the areas and other areas that wine might come from, not just the Falernian, Caecuban, and Cetinum, would be Praetutium, that the Greeks preferred, Picenum, northern Italy, well, sort of northern Italy, which was exported to Celts over the Alps. Hey, if you make it northern, it's easier to export it northern. Tarentum, down south, that Horace thought might one day rival Falernian. And Smyrna, which exported Pramnian wine to Rome. The eastern Aegean coast and Egypt were famous for their wines as well. Maronian, sometimes you'll see that spelled Myronian, as mentioned by Horace in his Cleopatra Ode, and also mentioned in the Odyssey. So here we've got a nice little map, and we can see Rhydicum way up there to the top. We can see Pucinum, we can see Picenum, we can see Sabinum, Praetutium, we can see Tarentum, and Mamertinum in there, the big dark area in the middle being Latium and Campania. There are long growing seasons in cooler climates, and when grapes are planted there, they produce high acidity wines. You may have heard of the Bordeaux wines from the Bordeaux region, and they make dry table wines. Warm climates produce wines with high sugar content, and those make excellent dessert wines, such as Andalusian wines from northern Spain. Grapes for just general purpose called table wines usually have an equal proportion of the glucose and fructose sugars, making a nice balanced, smooth, sweet, because Romans like sweet, wine. But if you want to make dessert wines, they want a higher proportion of fructose to glucose. There, we've been good and technical. Grape skins are covered by this stuff called bloom, which is a waxy film, and that captures the yeast bacteria. No yeast, no fermentation, no wine. The enzymes of the wine yeast are what change the grape sugars into alcohol, and they produce some byproducts which partially account for the various flavors of wine and how wine flavor, even from the same type of grape grown in the same area, will change from year to year. When you look at a grape, it's about 15% solid, meaning the skin, the stem, and the seeds, and about 85% pulp and juice, which is called the must. This must is mostly water, but depending on the grape, it's 18 to 25% sugars and between 0.3 and 1.5% of the acids, tartaric, malic, citric, and oxalic, which give it much of its flavor. Also adding to the flavor and the aroma and the bouquet of your wine are the amino acids in the grapes and vitamins in the grapes and enzymes and minerals, which provide the nutrients to the fermenting yeasts. Different combinations of these items are going to produce different flavors, even from the same type of grapes. The tannins in the grape skins add some astringency. They make the red wines have that little bit of bite to them. You may know tannins from the tannic acid in black tea. If you've ever eaten the grape skin without the grape, maybe you're one of those who peels it off first, then you know that astringent bite that you get. How does it change color? Well, there's pigments in the grapes, and there are anthocyanins, which add color as well from the grape skins and the grape pulp. Most of what we know about grape growing comes from Italy. Probably its representative methods throughout the empire, and as Romans export the culture of grape growing into wine, those production methods go with them. So how do they do it? Grapes are grown on vines. If you've driven by and seen a vineyard, you can see those long wires, and the grapevines grow along those. Those are the staked out versions. Or the Romans would often allow them to grow up poplars and elms, both types of trees having low enough branches that you could reach them to harvest the grapes. Grapes are then picked and sorted and sent to a press room where, like the olives, we're going to walk on them on the raised paved floor. The juice from this first pressing goes to an intermediate reservoir, or it goes into huge jars, the dolia, the same type of jars we saw for the olive oil, just not going to put the two of them in the same jar. Ew, gross. Next, you're going to use a mechanical press, could be that beam style, to remove more juice from the pulp. You can use the large wooden beam, just like we saw with the olives. They can use the ropes and levers or the screw mechanisms, just as we saw with the olives. And so we've got some pictures here of these two slaves pushing and pulling on the beams to produce the press of this grape harvest. Or here we have a much later mosaic. This is 6th century AD, where we have two slaves who seem to be walking on the largest grapes ever produced in order to create wine. So we had that central piece, and the wine, or the pressed juice, because it's not wine yet, flows out into those various rectangles as reservoirs to hold the juice until we can turn it into wine. So the residue, the leftover, is often mixed with water to make a drink, sort of a basic grape juice, or you could use that in cooking to add flavor to your meals. The pressed juice was then left to ferment in those large dolia. These dolia were usually sunken into the ground in the farmyard near the press room, or it could be fermented in those large vats or barrels. Romans did do wooden barrels, but they liked the dolia better. Those were much more common. So here we have some dolia sunken into a courtyard. This is from the villa at Boscareale, and you can see they're close enough to the surface for access, but low enough that they are buried in the nice cool ground. So once fermentation has worked its wonders and we've converted sugars into alcohols, the wine would be transferred, it's already been transformed, into amphorae and left to mature. Can you drink fresh wine? Yes, you can, but the human palate prefers wine to be aged and matured, and it develops different flavors. The stuff that was left over, the squashed remnants, was often turned into fertilizer, just as the squashed remnants of the olives. Up to the time of Augustus, planting vines was prohibited outside of Italy. Oh, sure, those barbarians and other folks could have them, but they couldn't get Italian vines, and Italians couldn't go and transfer their vines elsewhere. Wine was usually bottled at the farm or the estate where it was produced, and it was put into estate-made amphorae. Some came from independent potters, but there weren't huge amphorae factories churning out amphorae to be bought and used. Local production. They could put stamps stamped into the clay on the handles, on the spikes and the body, and those markings usually show the estate or owner where the wine came from, not the potter who created the amphorae. These amphorae, in order to be stored and left to mature, were originally sealed with a cork stopper. Later they changed that to fired clay bungs, so a clay stopper called an operculum, a little work thingy. I love that name. And then either way, with cork or the clay bung, they would seal them with cement or with lime mortar. They wanted to make sure that this was sealed and stayed sealed, which is great because that gives your wine time to mature without interference. These amphorae, because clay is permeable, would be lined with rosin, the solid residue from pine resin distillation. And that meant that your wine was not going to all evaporate through the clay or soak into the clay and lose a lot of your production. And the major fear of vintners in the ancient world was that your wine would become vinegar if it wasn't properly sealed. This could still happen, but much less often with modern production methods. So the Romans called this process of your wine turning into vinegar acor, and they wanted to do their very best to make sure it wasn't going to happen. But it seems the main reason that acor did happen is that they couldn't resist tampering with the jars once they were sealed. They needed to peek at the wine. They needed to taste the wine. Modern vintners still do an occasional tasting called a barrel tasting, where you open the barrel and take a taste, but our hygienic methods of keeping bacteria out are better. All right, so what happens? Well, no external evidence of the acor process happening can be seen. You can look at a sealed jar, and unless the seal is obviously broken or tampered with, you have no way to tell that this could be taking place. So Pliny says you should open it up and take a look. Dip a lead sheet into the wine, and if there's any color change, you've got some acor happening. Of course, when you opened it to take a look, you may have introduced the bacteria that would cause the very problem itself. Columella, that great agriculturist, had some acor preventatives. He says adding salt to the must, or fumigating your amphorae before putting the wine in, or adding a small amount of pitch resin after the second fermentation will either prevent or help prevent this process from taking place. It's interesting that all of those are either antibacterial or antifungal, and on the other hand, they may be something which increases the acidity, But all three of those things, antibacterial, antifungal, and perhaps increasing the acidity, are things which can indeed help to prevent acor. But then again, some of those you do before you've sealed up the wine, and if you leave it alone, it's your best bet. Don't peak. But if those don't work, you can always cheat. You can add some sweet perfumes or herbs to it to disguise. You can't stop it. Once it's in full flare, it won't stop. If it gets to the point that you can actually see these large, they call them blooms of bacteria in there, kiss it goodbye, you got vinegar. But you might be able to flavor it up long enough to fool someone. Roman law did give buyers the right to taste from an amphora before they paid the full price, but of course, acor in the early stages is tasteless. So you, either unaware that acor is happening, or if you're unscrupulous, you are aware that it's happening, but it's only at the beginning stage, you may still sell that wine. Or if you don't know it's there, you're selling it innocently. So the earliest evidence of people exchanging and trading wine around the Mediterranean basin comes from the 6th century BCE, where Etruscans and Greeks and the Carthaginians were trading, and Rome was exporting from Italy to Gaul by the 3rd century BCE. Yes, the Gauls were not originally winemakers. They got it from the Italians. The earliest amphorae we found with Latin inscriptions come from the first half of the 3rd century BCE, so that's pretty good and far back. There was a great demand rising from the 2nd century BC on for exports to southern Gaul because they didn't have viticulture. There were some wild grapes that grew, but not many, and they weren't terribly tasty, and they had no earthly idea how to turn that stuff into wine. But exports from Italy peaked in the mid-1st century BCE, so says our friend Diodorus, and he says they peaked with the price of 1 amphora equal to 1 slave in Gaul. That's expensive wine. So, why was wine production declining in Italy? Well, those prime Caecuban vineyards, the ones that produced one of the top 3 types, fell into disrepair because Nero built a canal through them from Lake Baiae to Ostia. Kind of hard to grow grapes that way. Why else might it be declining? Well, the soil was becoming exhausted. Italy had been inhabited for a good while, and they hadn't come up with the crop rotations and all the modern wonderful things, and returning parts of grapes as fertilizer could only do so much. There was a big plague from 167 CE, which lasted over 15 years, killed off an awful lot of people. Fewer people, lower demand for wine. Of course, some of those who were left were probably drinking a little more because of tough times, but it's still lower demand. And many of the people who could have been growing the grapes, the farmhands, had been conscripted into the civil wars, which took place after Septimius Severus. And if they're in the armies, then they're not growing grapes. So how do we measure wine? We know some measurements. We know the modern metric system. We know the traditional ounces and such. Well, the Romans had their very own for wine measurements. So here we go. You could have 4 cochlearia, which make up 1 chiathus. You could have 6 cochlearia, which make up 1 acetabulum. You could have 2 acetabula, which make up 1 quartarius. You could have 2 quartarii, which make up 1 hemina. And you could have 2 heminae, which make up 1 sextarium. So we're all clear and set on that, right? That's absolutely lucid. No, it's not. Let's help you out a little bit. A cochlea, named for the snail shell shape, or a ligular, which is a spoonful, is the smallest unit. It's 0.34 fluid ounces. So when we start doing all the math on those, and it works out that 1 sextarium is about a pint of wine. Not bad. We've got a few more measures here. You could put 12 hemini together and make a congius. You could put 8 congii together to make up 1 amphora, and 20 amphorae make up a couleus. So 20 amphorae equals 144 US gallons. So the standard, now I say standard rather loosely because amphorae varied. They were handmade items. They could be bigger and smaller. You could also make very small ones for sitting at your table. You could make very large ones for transporting, but the amphora unit used for wine holds about a cubic Roman foot, which as we see is about 25.79 liters or about 7 US gallons. So it's like one of those 5-gallon water bottles that they put on the water dispensers, and not quite half of another one. That's a good size amount of liquid. In the late Republican era, there were large wine exports from Italy out to their new provinces. Some went to the legions, of course. Some went to the veterans who made up the populations of the colony, and some went to locals. Italian wine became a prestige item for the Celts. It became a sign of wealth, and much of it not drunk but stockpiled and given out to the poor and their dependents as a confirmation of the giver's social status, much the way in later literature they would give out the gold armbands to the bards or to the participants at a feast. They were giving out the wine as social status. I notice no one makes note of whether the dependents were drinking it or also stockpiling it. I'm thinking drinking. Wine was traded to southwest Gaul, and what did the Romans get back in return? Locally mined silver, copper, lead, or ironwork. Wine was also traded for woolen clothing and salted hams, which were popular in Rome. If you've ever tried to create your good Roman costume from scratch, and I mean starting with either the flax plants or the sheep, it's an awful lot of work to even make a small amount of fabric. So I can see I would certainly trade wine for completed clothing. So how much wine was being traded around? About 40,000 amphorae. Oh, I've got an extra zero in there, I'm sorry. 40,000 amphorae per year to Gaul. So when it comes to Italy, it's going to be offloaded. Here we're offloading from the ship right up next to the shore, but if you had to use a gangplank and any of that were dropped, they actually had a special group called the Falangarii who would jump down in there and retrieve the wine. You weren't going to let it go to waste in the harbor, and you certainly weren't going to let the harbor fill up with those amphorae. So we're going to transfer them to small boats once we've brought it from wherever, to go up to the Tiber, to the docks in the southwest corner of Rome. The wholesalers get a hold of those amphorae next, and they would go to storage in warehouses, such as the Horea Galbana. And then those are transferred to cellars in Rome, where they would be decanted into those dolia, those big sunken jars again. So if you were in a large house or an estate, or perhaps storing them in a warehouse, or they would be transferred to shops and taverns as smaller amphorae by means of hand carts. In all of this, where's been the bureaucracy? Where's been the government? Well, you know it's there. Paperwork said they needed tituli picti, the painted slogans, the painted inscriptions, on the neck and the shoulders. The neck, the top part, the shoulders where it widens out to become the body, that usually included 3 parts of information about this amphorae and its contents. So the top number would be the empty weight of the amphorae, excuse me, the empty weight of the amphorae, because of course, made of clay, hand produced, they could vary. The middle piece of information would be the retailing mercator, the merchant's name, not necessarily the estate where it was produced, but who has brought it to Rome. And the bottom would include the contents weight, how much wine was actually in this amphorae. Household slaves could be sent with jugs to be replenished at the local wine shop, so you could take smaller jugs to go and fill them. Or you yourself could go to a tavern and sit or stand and drink your wine from a beaker, like a large mug. How much wine? Well, by the 1st century CE, the demand for wine was about 23 million gallons per year. That's a lot. The empty amphorae, once they've been unloaded and emptied, could be used as ballast to get your boat back from Rome to Ostia, or they could be broken and dumped up to become that Monte Testaccio, which we saw, about 2/3 olive oil amphorae, about 1/3 wine and other amphorae, and that thing is 150 feet high and a half-mile around, so we did see the picture and how huge it is. It's interesting that the deepest layer of Mount Testaccio is Italian wine, and then the middle layer becomes Spanish wines, and then toward the top, North African wines were becoming dominant as the imports. Legionary trade, of course, created quite a demand for wine. Excuse me. About 100 gallons per man per year works out to about 500,000 gallons per year for the Republican era legions. The only text that mentions specific amounts for civilians comes from the 153 CE inscription from the College of Aesculapius and Hygeia on the Via Appia. And of course this would be people who were healthy and wealthy, with Aesculapius and Hygeia, the medical god and goddess. So how much does it say? Well, it says that its members would get 470 gallons per year for the high-ranking ones and 104 gallons per year for the low-ranking. They are not clear whether that's for that member's sole consumption or for his household, but that's still a pretty good amount, especially since the average Italian now drinks about 25 gallons. We're also talking about unwatered wines, right? This is before we started diluting them. So when they say 470 gallons, that could make as much as 4 times more when the water is added. So what are the wine uses? Well, yes, the obvious. We're going to drink it, either as just simply drinking or drinking for intoxication purposes. Wine was indeed a daily beverage for all people and all social classes, usually due to the questionable safety of most water. Yes, water coming from a nice, clear, beautiful aqueduct up in the mountains, and you've got a pipe bringing it directly into your house. Awesome. Wash with the water, cook with the water, sure, but if you were getting it from wells or from some of the fountains, it may have traveled through a few less savory places before it got to you, and so you would add it to wine. Much Roman wine came from the late harvest grapes. They had a higher sugar content, which thus gave it a much higher alcohol content. So Roman wine was served watered down a little bit. Usually 4-to-1 for daily drinking at home, 3-to-1 or 3-to-2 for a dinner or dinner and drinking party. Despite this massive availability and consumption of wine, Romans don't seem to have had restrictions on when it was proper to serve red or white, but they did recommend certain types with different courses. So it didn't matter whether you were serving red meat or white meat, it mattered which course you were on. So when you sat down to your gustatio, your appetizer, or you were finishing up with your secunda mensa, your dessert, you would get mulsum or possum, 2 of the sweeter wines. The mensa prima, the first table, the main meal, would usually include a less sweet wine. So maybe after dinner or just for a gathering of friends, you would have a commissatio, the drinking party. You may appoint someone or choose someone through some sort of game or lottery as the arbiter bibendi. This judge of drinking is going to decide the mix for all guests, or may decide to let each guest choose their own proportions. So sometimes the water was already mixed into the wine and everybody got the same type. Sometimes they would bring the water and wine to each guest and let him choose. At taverns and during a commissatio, they had lots of drinking games. One of them was to drink 1 chiathus per letter of a woman's name. So that's 1.5 ounces of wine per letter of her name. So if the name proposed was one of nice short letters, no big deal. Perhaps you had Priscilla, then you had a lot of letters to drink. So here we have this gentleman reclining at his party, and he does seem to be holding his cup rather oddly. Perhaps he's about to play the drinking game after everyone has finished, and you have had your cup refilled all the way down to emptying out the amphorae, where sometimes there are what's called the dregs left. These would be solids, stems, seeds, a little bit of leaf or skin, and normally the pointy bottom of the amphorae would collect that, but if you had to tip it up to drain out the amphorae, some of that would indeed get into the guests' cups. And then they would take the cups and set up a target in the middle of the dining room or the tavern, and they would sling those little bits of dregs to see who would hit the target. Of course, that created quite a messy cleanup for the poor folks doing the cleaning up. Romans frowned on alcoholism, which may sound rather strange since there was wine everywhere. And, you know, if you've watched too many bad movies, they all seem to think that's the best part of the whole movie. But no, you could drink, you could get drunk. What you couldn't let it do is impact your next day's behavior. So if you were showing up late to the Senate, if you couldn't get to your day job, if you were so unfortunate as to actually have to go to work on time, then this was frowned upon. You would be socially ostracized. But there are some instances where they gave drunkenness as a legal defense. So how did you drink but not get too drunk? One would be to eat something similar to mashed potatoes or milk, something starchy, something with fat content. Skim milk's not going to work for you here. That would slow the absorption of the wine. There's also the decorative version, wear an ivy crown in honor of Bacchus, or a flower crown, which would open the pores and let your wine fumes out, therefore you couldn't get drunk. There's an alternative version of this, though, that you wear these scented things because wine fumes are volatile, and the wine fumes would go right up your nose because your nose is right above your mouth where you're drinking, and when they would go straight from your nose into your brain, because of course your nose is right there conveniently in front of your brain. And so if you wore something with a lot of scent, it could keep the wine fumes from getting to your nose and thus from your nose to your brain, so you didn't get drunk so fast. So when you see them wearing lots of roses or something very well scented, they're intending to drink, but not to get too drunk. By the way, this does not work. Do not go tell the state trooper who stops you that you're not drunk because your Latin teacher told you that lots of scent stopped the alcohol. Nope, doesn't work. Wines could also be used as a base for medicines. So lots of things could be dissolved in it to help you take your medicine. Of course, some of those really strongly flavored or scented ones could also disguise poisons, so be careful what you're drinking. There is, however, a double standard when it comes to women. Women were shamed for drinking in public. Restraint was expected in private as well, so you couldn't even go home and have your wine. They were allowed a few measures of possum on certain special occasions, but a Roman woman was not supposed to drink to get drunk. She certainly wasn't supposed to be a merombibula, the unwatered wine drinker. That was a terrible insult to call anyone. Don't end up looking like one of these bacchantes here. Wild woman We have the case of Ignatius Macenius, who beat his wife to death with a club because she was drinking and would not stop. And no charges were brought because they saw it as justified. Women aren't to drink. Or perhaps worse, the matron who was recorded as starved to death by her family. She had had a drinking problem. They took the keys away. They locked them up. She broke into the casket holding the keys, and they locked her in her room to starve to death. So says Pliny. And of course we have some sources here because it's never complete without sources. So thank you for your time, much appreciated, and I hope we've all enjoyed a little bit of time together.